Hi, I'm Colleen Johnson, the Executive Director of the Peoria Historical Society. It's my pleasure today to introduce Carl Adams. And Carl, could you tell us a little bit about who you are and what your background is?
My name is Carl Adams. I'm from Alton, Illinois, originally, the town that I regarded as the Mason-Dixon line of Illinois, where everything south of Alton seemed to be a little bit uh, uh, pro-slavery, whereas north of Alton was anti-slavery, and it grew. And that was my interest partially in Illinois history, and I became a fan of Abraham Lincoln, and I grew up through the tumultuous times known as the Civil Rights Movement. And it made an indelible mark on my entire life. I would have to say that the experiences that I had during the Civil Rights Movement in the late 50s and 60s ultimately led to me treating Nance as a human being and a person and interested in writing about the human side of a slave.
Well, that's wonderful. Let's get to the very thing that you said, Nance, and
Mm-hmm.
you've written a book
Mm-hmm.
about this wonderful woman.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us how you first found Nance. We in my office we still refer to her as Nancy, but that's because I'm a Southerner.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to go back and forth. You said either
Yeah.
is correct
Yeah.
depending on.
Either is correct because where she was raised by a Kentucky family from central pioneer frontier Kentucky, and there were a number of African American female servants in central Kentucky with the same name, Nance, Nance.
Okay.
However, when Thomas Cox went bankrupt in the mid 1820s and he was forced to sell his possessions, including Nance, he sold Nance to the richest man of Sangamon County in Springfield, and his household changed her name from Nance with an E to Nancy with a Y, and then took her to his boarding house in Peoria County, but not until after the court cases settled it. And so by the time they landed, the Tazewell County had been invented out of Peoria County. And so the land was on the other side of the river, but it was actually Peoria County when Nathan Cromwell first laid claim to land here.
So how did you come upon this story?
Excuse me. It was, believe it or not, a thumbnail history sketch that was in a free newspaper called a Shopper. I
Mhm.
think it was the Tazewell Express or the Pekin Express, and I think it was published by the same firm that publishes the Peoria Journal Star. So it was
Wow.
published by Peoria Journal Star, and there was a summary of a Tazewell County history, and there was one sentence, a grand total of one sentence, that it had been the hometown of a Negro girl named Nance, first slave freed by Abraham Lincoln. But what really caught my attention was 1841.
Mhm.
And my knowledge of history and the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, I'm going, oh, wait a minute. That was 20 years before the Civil War. Lincoln,
Mhm.
now some African American historians are saying Abraham Lincoln never freed a single slave. Now, this record says 20 years before the Civil War, he freed a first slave. Okay, I'm going to go to the library. I'm going to research every book I can find. I'm going to dig this up because I'm a journalism student.
Mhm.
If this is a local story, maybe there's a local follow up story. Maybe there's for an investigation, a cold case
Mhm.
file, something worth looking at. And I started digging. No other writers had written about Nance. It was
It's
only like a
amazing.
half a dozen, and the first one was back in 1866. But in the
Wow.
last 100 years, no one had written anything about Nance. And
Wow.
so I looked at all the references, and all it said was a Negro girl named Nance. And what I was thinking was, how did a black servant who was a slave end up in the middle of the Corn Belt, in the middle of Illinois, when it's hundreds of miles to any plantation? How did this come about? First of all, she had to have had a mother and a father. Did she have a sister? Did she have a brother? Who was her husband? Did she ever have any children? What was her last name? That was not recorded anywhere.
Did it tell you how old she was when?
Not at first. I
Not at
had to
first.
dig for that. I had to
Hmm.
dig and then dig and dig and dig and dig. And so somebody asked me, well, how do you do the genealogy of a slave? Well, first of all, it's almost impossible to do a genealogy of a slave because their last names kept changing.
Changing.
So the way you do it is you trace the genealogies of the white families who claim to have owned the slave,
Hmm.
body and soul. Follow that family because then there's a paperwork trail. Once you find the paperwork trail, follow it until you find some answers. And that's basically what I was into after. As a journalist and a trained journalist, I was only interested in the most important journalistic facts. Exactly who, exactly
Hmm.
where, exactly when, and then how and why will eventually fall into place. But nobody knew exactly who, where, or when. And so I had to find the trail.
So,
And so I
how
filed
old was
paperwork.
Nance when she first was making her case for freedom?
13.
13 years old.
Age
She's
13.
a very young
Very young, no
black
money,
slave.
illiterate.
And where is she living at the time?
Where she was living at the time in Springfield, but she was officially acknowledged by the court to be an orphan because her father had died when she was age 4, and her mother had been sold away from her children at age 7. And so she was biologically, her biological parents basically rendered her an orphan. Her mother may still been alive, but
Right.
she lived over along the Mississippi River, and she was over on the Sangamon River, and so the odds are high they never saw each other again, ever.
So she's 13, she's precocious, she goes to court, and that's it. End of story.
Actually,
Mhm.
she did not go to court. She was dragged into
She was
court
dragged into
as
court.
a victim
Mm.
because she was shackled and confined and apparently suffered from a lack of food and water because there
Mm.
was an Indian war going on at the time, the Winnebago War, when she was locked in a lawn
Mm.
shed in Springfield. Excuse me.
Wow.
And so she was somewhat deprived. Plus, she had been beaten. And the reason why she was beaten was because she refused to cooperate. She was being
Wow.
uppity. But at the same
Mm.
time, she was just being a 13-year-old child.
Mm.
She was told, you're going to go into this man's household and serve him. And her reaction to that was, I don't know him. No, I'm not going to do it. So she was beaten up, shackled, tied, thrown, and confined.
So what
And
happened when she went to court?
when she went to court, at first, the judge simply didn't believe the testimonies. He didn't believe any of them because, excuse me, apparently Nance was coached by Thomas Cox's mother, grandmother Eliza
Hmm.
Robinson Cox. She was in her 60s, and she testified on Nance's behalf, but she also lied about Nance's age. She said Nance is about, and of course that qualifying word got my attention, she is about 16 years old.
Mm.
So that would suggest that she was precociously mature.
Hmm.
But since I found the families and traced it back through the 6 different counties they lived in, I ultimately find Nance's parents in what was known as the Registry of Negroes and Mulattoes of the Illinois Territory, entered from the slave state of Missouri before it was even a territory. It was still part of the Louisiana Territory
Hmm.
when they crossed the river from the Missouri Boot Heel
Hmm.
into southern Illinois, and that was Randall Leggins, who was born in 1772 in
Hmm.
South Carolina, and his younger wife, Anarchy Leggins. She was about 20, she was in her mid 20s when she
Okay.
gave birth to Nance. And she had 3 children. The oldest one was Reuben, who was 2 years older, 2 to 3 years older than Nance, and a third child named Dicey, another girl 2 to 3 years younger than Nance. Now, all 3 of them were taken to Springfield, Sangamon County, in
Hmm.
the 1820s. But Ruby, being an older teenager at this point, 15, 16, he could work for somebody else and get Thomas
Hmm.
Cox the money from another landowner. He was farmed out.
Yeah.
So he was almost never in Springfield. He was out in the country working.
Hmm.
And so Nance and Dicey were domestic servants in the finest house in the county at the time in Springfield in 1825
Okay.
when Thomas Cox became a hardcore corn liquor addict. And he quite literally lost everything. He almost even lost his life and almost lost his family. But he did manage to hang on to those, but he lost all of his property. And it was auctioned off by court order.
Oh, there's a whole nother story
Oh,
there.
yeah,
Oh
there
my
is.
good. You've got
The
books
story just
here. You've got
goes
books.
and goes
Well,
and
I
goes.
imagine as you started to dig through each piece, it became more interesting and more
Hmm.
interesting and more interesting. So, Nancy, nobody believes her. She goes to court, and tell us what prevails after that.
Well, what happened is Illinois had just had a popular referendum that the legislature of Illinois wanted to make Illinois a perpetual slavery state
Hmm.
in 1824. And the anti slavery folks rallied and fought them, literally. In fact, Illinois is the one of only two states that the Illinois Capitol building burned. And the Illinois Capitol building was burned in 1823 during an anti abolition,
Mm.
pro slavery riot in Vandalia.
Mm.
And so it was a very hot topic.
Yeah.
And so when they defeated the move to make Illinois a slave state in 1824, the judges, including a Supreme Court justice, said, okay, we want to fix slavery on the state of Illinois by Supreme Court precedent.
Hmm.
And so they brought like three, four, five different slavery cases between 1825 and 1828, and Nance's was first on the list. Nance, a woman of color, versus John Howard. Now, who was this guy, John Howard?
Hmm.
John Howard was the guy who initiated the lawsuit against abolitionist Governor Edward Coles
Hmm.
to harass him and fine him $2,000 for freeing 10 slaves in southern Illinois. This was the same guy. He was the one who launched the lawsuit against an abolitionist governor. And then he shows up in Springfield
Mm.
as a county official, seizes Nance, and when she refuses to cooperate, he beats her up and locks her in a log cabin courthouse. Now, two of the lawyers that came up, one was judge from another part of Illinois, Judge Samuel McRoberts,
Hmm.
and he eventually became a United States Senator. The other one was one of the first Supreme Court justices in the state of Illinois. His name was John Reynolds, who 3 years later became Illinois governor. They were there as pro slavery lawyers trying to fix slavery on Illinois by Supreme Court precedent, and they succeeded for 10 years. And the person who spoiled their plan was when Nance went back to the Supreme Court 10 years later with Abraham Lincoln as her attorney.
So they have to have these test cases
Mm-hmm.
so they can make new law. And here, the perfect combination.
Right. She was a test case to make it an indentured servitude legal in Illinois, and it worked because she was a child. The
Yeah.
court declared her an orphan. And so then she goes on with Cromwell, and she lives the life of a domestic servant um, for the next 10 years. And then she ends up having thought about all this for so long that when she was matured and she was 13 years old and now pregnant with her first baby, now she has more motivation than ever
Hmm.
because she wants her child to have a better life than she had. You know, whether it was boy or girl didn't matter at the time. She was pregnant. And so that was when she initiated the next case, which evolved into Bailey versus Cromwell.
Hmm.
And when Lincoln first talked to her in 1839, Nance already had two infant daughters and was pregnant with her first son. And that was when Lincoln took the case. And what had happened in the meantime was that Alton had had this riot of anti-abolition riot that murdered Elijah Lovejoy, which created
Hmm.
international news.
Yep.
Following that, in the following January, Abraham Lincoln makes his first great political speech, perpetuation of our political institutions, in January of 1838, in which it was a law and order presentation. He said all these anti-abolition riots and all this mob action is not conducive to good law and order. So he was giving a law and order speech. And it was pretty well understood by everyone in Springfield at the Lyceum that he was actually referring to the murder of the abolitionist newspaper publisher in my hometown of Alton.
Do you think this case tells us anything about Lincoln and what his beliefs were?
Lincoln's beliefs was he grew up poor, and so he identified with the poor. And of course, since he came from a slave state and then lived in two indentured servitude states, Indiana and Illinois were the only two indentured servitude states, he was then acutely aware of poor black as well as poor white. And he could see that maintaining slavery among poor whites it was not productive of any good for anybody, really. And when it came to the political issues of slavery, though, he was still struggling because he did not see a clear-cut answer. Politics was going to be tricky, and he was
And it
not a
was.
highly educated man. And so he basically learned politics while he was also running for public office. But he understood early on that while he wanted all people everywhere to be free, that there was an intense prejudice against all black people in Illinois, whether slave or free. Illinois didn't want either one. And so this was the racial prejudice that we all grew up with so long as you were in Illinois. And a member of the Lincoln group that I'm a member of back in D.C. says, I am a doctor of psychology. I have studied all of this. He says, but I can honestly say that I can't testify for certain that I'm 100% free of prejudice. And that's a human condition. Nobody can be 100% free
Right.
of prejudice.
Right.
But we, using culture and compassion and maturity,
And
we can,
education.
and education, we can work through it. And so
That's why
that,
I think books like yours are so important
yes.
because we're hearing the factual story
Mm-hmm.
of a 13-year-old
Mm-hmm.
human trafficked,
Mm-hmm.
all the things that would make us all cringe if it were any of our own
Absolutely.
children today,
Absolutely.
anybody's children today.
Sure.
This really happened not that long ago, and the repercussions that slavery we're still left with.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Nance's story, it goes on
And
and
on.
on, but she has great success, I think, from what she's come from.
Sure. Absolutely.
Her son, tell us about her first son.
Her first son fought in the Civil War with the 1st Regiment Illinois Colored Volunteers. He grew up as a hostler. He took care of white men's horses, probably even Lincoln's horse, because they lived right along the Peoria Road.
Wow.
And so, in the course of the Civil War, he was wounded, sent to the hospital in D.C., recovered, rejoined his unit. When his unit was sent to Galveston, Texas, and he witnessed the original June 19th, 1865, of which I am now a education member of the National Juneteenth National Organization. Now, the icing on the cake was that we have found Nance's grave. So we have the beginning, and now we have the end. We found Nance's grave just last year, right here in downtown Peoria, which is actually where her story began, was in Peoria. And so it's kind of fitting that it ends. And it was very curious that your colleague Bob Hoffer sent me a picture of the Lincoln mural out here. And from a
Amazing.
certain angle, it shows that Lincoln is actually looking down on the last house that Nance lived in Peoria,
I mean,
on North Adams.
if she stood on her front porch,
Mm-hmm.
she would have been able to have seen
Mm-hmm.
that mural.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing.
Yes,
Just it's amazing.
absolutely.
Had you heard of the Moffitt Cemetery?
No, no. When Bob
No.
Hoffer told me about that, I said, "How do you spell that?"
Yeah.
And when I tried to communicate to somebody else, they said, "How do you spell that?" And I said, "Think in terms of Mo Fat." That's what it looks like. But the whole the big thrust behind this was that this was a principal theme of my theory of American history, of history in black and white.
Yeah.
They needed each other
Mm-hmm.
to fulfill each other. Lincoln needed a test case for slavery. Nance needed an attorney to get her out of it. It was a mutual need. It was a mutual cooperation. There is every reason to believe that they remained friends for life until Lincoln went to Washington in 1860 and not returned. But there's every reason to believe that he saw her and her 8 children playing along the Pekin-Peoria Road every year up and through 1859.
Oh, I'd love to believe that. That's the best. And she lived until she was in her 70s,
Uh,
76,
72.
72. And she was living with
78. 78.
okay, she was
She
living
died
with
in 92, 78 years old.
and
Excuse me.
she was living with one of her daughters
Well,
and her
with her
family
daughter,
right here in
Amanda,
Peoria.
her oldest daughter, Amanda, yeah.
Yeah. So the Moffitt Cemetery was only found because, really, of all the efforts Bob Hoffer put into finding
Mm-hmm.
one of his wife's ancestors.
Right, right.
And he discovered that this whole cemetery
Mm-hmm.
was sold, bulldozed, covered over,
And it was
paved,
just neglected.
and there were so many veterans buried there,
Mm-hmm.
Civil War veterans on up.
Mm-hmm.
But when we found out that Nance was buried there, and he found the proof,
Mm-hmm.
this is now going to bring national attention
Mm-hmm.
to the Moffitt
Mm-hmm.
Cemetery and to her life.
Yeah. Well, one other curious coincidence that I came up with was that the an area again on South Side Peoria where a pauper cemetery was,
Mm-hmm.
where a number of African Americans were buried. They now have the headstone of the Lincoln branch of the Peoria Public Library as their headstone. That used to be a cemetery as well.
Wow. Yep.
So,
You are a wealth of information. Tell us what's next for you, because I think there's another book or two in there.
oh, well, at 69 years old, I really dread the thought of making another book. But my children are encouraging another book. Other
Good.
people are asking for another book. And a guy at the writers group said, he said, well, think you've already got 100 pages here. Just put another 100 pages in front of it, another 100 pages behind it. You got the book done. That's an
Just that's it.
oversimplification
That's
for
it.
sure.
You're ready.
But anyway, no, we will go to the Red, Black, and Green Ball
Yes.
tomorrow night. And I will also be visiting the Proctor Center and the
Great.
African American Museum over there, the Hall of Fame
Great.
Museum. And then I will be working with, as much as possible, with NAACP, Historical Society, African American Hall of Fame Museum,
And the
anyone
Peoria Riverfront Museum,
and Peoria
all of us
Riverfront
together.
Museum, and anyone who wants to join and try to have a proper, appropriate, and respectful memorial for the
Yes.
first slave freed by
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln.
So we're working on the memorial now, and I think there'll be several opportunities when you come back for us to do some speaking engagements.
Mm-hmm.
And this is enough to whet our appetite and to hear what a
Yeah.
great speaker you are. I know that you could do a college lecture tomorrow if we said let's bring everyone together. So you're ready to go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can. I'm not sure yet. It needs. We need to talk some more planning,
Hmm.
but it's got to be before the end of April,
Hmm.
and so either the third week of March or the third
Hmm.
week of April
Great.
to target that and talk to everybody who needs to be spoken with for planning
Great.
purposes. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. It's been the last 6 months of us having some phone conversations, and you sent us your book. You became a member of the Historical Society.
Mhm.
So I thank you for all of that, your
Sure.
support to us, and we're looking for ways that we can continue to support you.
Sure, sure, sure. And if we can arrange a some type of a seminar or a
We will.
presentation here, so we can collect money both for here, the Historical Society, and a marker, I'd be happy to do it. And I
Good.
did bring more copies of the book, so
Good. I've got
and I
lots
don't
of
want
people
to carry them
interested.
back
We're
either.
not carrying them back. We've got lots of people interested in the book, so we're going to sell the book.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. God love you. Nice meeting you.